Well, why don't we get started? I'd like to welcome everyone who's come today. We really appreciate your attending this webinar on building the listening reading connection for multilingual learners. I am Monica Brady-Myerov. I am the author of Listenwise, a book about teaching your students to be better listeners. And part of that book is devoted to English language learners, but it also covers reading and listening and building listening skills in general and how to assess listening. And I wrote this book after starting the company Listenwise, which I'll talk a little bit more about later in the webinar, but it's a listening skills building platform. And the way I got into that was because I was a reporter for NPR for more than 2 decades, making public radio stories and podcasts that tried to engage listeners and learners of all ages. And I really realized what a powerful medium audio is to engage and educate, and especially for English learners. So that's why I started Listenwise, the company. I am so thrilled to be joined by Valentina Gonzalez. She is also an author, reading and writing with English learners. She's an educational consultant with Sidelets Education and an amazing thought leader for multilingual learners. So Valentina, do you want to say a little bit more about your background, please?
Well, I am really thrilled to be here. Thank you for inviting me to talk about the listening reading connection. I think it's so critical for our multilingual learners. And I'm not going to share a lot about my background because there's really not a lot of time for us to dig deep into that. But let's just, let's get into this and talk about the listening reading connection. I'm so excited to be here, Monica. Thank you.
That's great. Yeah, because in today's webinar, we're going to share how educators can leverage academic podcast texts to deepen English learners' language proficiency and also strategies for listening and speaking. We'd love to hear from you, so please share who, comments or thoughts or who you are in the chat. And then in the Q&A section, love to hear your questions because we are leaving time for that at the end. So the resources and strategies shared in this webinar will integrate grade level rigor and simultaneously developing content knowledge, language and literacy skills that are really necessary for English learners to succeed. We're also going to be sharing some practical strategies to build students' academic language and listening and thinking skills. So Valentina, I'm so happy for you to join me, and let's get started. First on the research on learning language and listening.
Yeah, so, in the United States, our schools serve, and I know we have a lot of people listening today from outside of the United States, and I just want to welcome you all here. You're in the right place. But here in the United States, our schools serve roughly 5 million English learners or multilingual learners, and that is about 10% of our population. Over 400 languages are represented in that group of students. Multilingual learners, though, are not monolithic, meaning that each of them is diverse and very unique. And the special thing about multilingual learners in our schools and classrooms is that they join our classrooms at very different grade levels and with varied experiences and literacy in their first language. So it's important to embrace multilingual learners from an assets-based perspective. Yes, they're gaining English, but they also have language and literacy from their primary or native language that we can use as a leverage to help them acquire this second or third language that they're adding to their repertoire. So if we look on the next slide, we can see the language domains. We have listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And while reading and writing are very important, they all are important. Reading and writing are so important and often tested by state assessments. We have to invest in listening and speaking in order to build reading and writing. And sometimes that listening and speaking is overlooked because it isn't tested on those state assessments. It's often tested in language assessments, but not on those standardized assessments in grade level curriculum. All of these domains are integral. In fact, in order to become a successful reader and writer, it's important to have this like vast vocabulary bank in speaking and in listening, because the words that our students hear become their speaking vocabulary. And the words that they hear and speak then become the words that they can read and write. And so that's why it's so important that we're really intentional about the experiences that our multilingual learners have in our classrooms every day.
I love the idea of building the vocabulary bank with listening, because we listen to the equivalent of a book a day. We read far less than that. So our students are absorbing so much through just listening. So if you focus more on helping them become better listeners and giving them academic language rich podcasts and audio to listen to, you have a really great entryway into this. And I wanted to note too, Valentina, you're right. 22 states do test listening at the high stakes level for all students as part of their English language arts. So it's almost half.
Okay.
But in as far as English learners, of course, every year they're tested on it. And
Yes.
in a state like yours in Texas, it's equally weighted, reading, writing, speaking, and listening as a part of the assessment. So it's a very, I think it's a very important area for intentional practice. And yet it's often not really given a lot of time and thought to in the classroom.
And here's why I think that is, Monica, because in our classrooms, listening and speaking are often not a grade in the grade book. And so not a lot of attention is placed on them specifically, even when they are assessed at the high stakes assessment level, state mandated assessments. And yes, even in Texas, we have our English learners are assessed on listening and speaking, reading and writing, and it is each one of those domains has the same amount of it's equal, the percentage wise. It wasn't always like that. It used to be reading and writing was weighted heavier than listening and speaking, but now it is all equal. But I do believe it's because of that, for that reason, because we're not grading listening and speaking on a daily basis or even weekly.
You make a very, very good point, but I am encouraged to see that it's making its way into a more equal weighting to reading.
It's important.
Reading and writing, right. And I think it gets back to why like this listening and reading connection, because listening is fundamental to reading. I mean, this relates to why I started researching the power of listening and why I wrote the book Listenwise. Because if you look at these two pictures, which do students do first? They listen, of course.
Yeah.
Every student, either learning to read or learning a new language. Listening is the building blocks for learning. And it's long been understood that listening precedes reading or precedes speaking another language, but it's more complicated than you might think. Because according to an article in the Elementary School Journal, 23 major studies found correlations between reading and listening. And in general, the poor reader is also likely to be the poor listener. We've worked with a Dr. Tiffany Hogan, who's the director of speech and language literacy at Massachusetts General Hospital here. And she's conducted foundational work on how increasingly higher level language skills, such as listening, help students improve their reading comprehension. And she writes that children comprehend when they are able to accurately and fluently translate print into spoken language that they can understand. So going back to that idea, Valentina, of the vocabulary bank, if you're hearing that vocabulary in the spoken word and you're also seeing it, that helps you understand spoken language at a much deeper level. And that means that sentence, and also they're hearing sentence structure, and that assists their reading and understanding. The other, listening is also fundamental to reading comprehension development. I mean, this is the Simple View of Reading by Goff and Tumner, and that suggests that reading is a function of two key components: decoding and language comprehension. I mean, I experienced this firsthand with my own child who had a reading disability. And this is what led me to really start Listenwise and start research on listening, because she was struggling with word decoding, but could understand everything she heard. So getting into that listening part of this equation by building her background with audio and vocabulary and syntax exposure really helped her, because it really leads to a much greater fluency. But I know that there's been more research on this that you'd like to share, which I find very interesting, that's been more updated to really dig into this more about how
Right.
listening
And
plays into this.
I do think that's such a powerful experience that you had with your daughter, and that drives the work you do. And it's so important that we know that. Thank you for sharing that with us. And while many of us as educators are familiar with that simple view of reading, which shows how important reading is and that it's a product of decoding and listening comprehension, there has been a lot of new research and a lot of new information since then. And so the science of reading has evolved and will continue to evolve and progress. So recently, Dr. Nell Duke and Dr. Kelly Cartwright introduced an active view of reading model. And one of the key features of this active view of reading model is that it shows how word recognition and language comprehension, or sometimes called listening comprehension, overlap rather than work in isolation. And important processes bridge the two of these components. And so if we look inside that circle of language comprehension, we see that it includes cultural and content knowledge, background knowledge, verbal reasoning, language structures, theory of mind, which means understanding one own's or others' mental state, such as like their thoughts and feelings. And these are all components that actually can vary culturally and linguistically. So it's very important to understand not only the processes, but also individual children and multilingual learners. Like we said, they're not monolithic. So they're going to come to us with such varied background experiences, varied content knowledge, varied vocabulary. And when we read, we are listening to ourselves. And that's such an important thing to recognize. If you stop to read something, you are actually listening to yourself, but you're doing it silently. When all of us, when we started learning to read, we were taught to read aloud, but eventually we began to read silently. And if I'm looking at my paper right now next to me, and when I read it, I'm silently reading and I'm listening to myself. And that listening comprehension is important. But if I don't know the vocabulary and the words that I'm reading, then I'm not going to comprehend the text or what I'm listening to in my mind. So that's an important component that we have to keep at the forefront when we're working with multilingual learners. Oh, we're not hearing you, Monica.
I'm sorry, I have a cough, so I mute, and then I forgot to unmute. So I wanted to share that something I learned from Dr. Jeff Swears from Stanford, who he and I did a webinar recently, was that when listening to something being read or a podcast, it helps because you're not having to decode and get tripped up. There's a lot of processing that goes on neurologically to read. Your eyes are translating the words on the page, and your cortex is figuring out what the words say, and then you're making images in your mind and you're trying to understand them. Whereas when you're listening to something, it's a much more fluid process that happens more automatically, and you make a movie in your mind. So in a way, you're also building your own background knowledge, or you're drawing on that to make images and pictures of what you hear. And often if you're faced with a difficult text or a story that might be difficult for somebody to read because they're not at that level yet, but they listen to it, it breaks down one of those barriers to comprehension. The other interesting thing I wanted to share is that listening comprehension outpaces reading comprehension until the middle school years. And this is a graph I took from a Common Core presentation. This is why in the Common Core, listening and speaking is now an anchor standard, because there's a recognition here of how important listening is to reading comprehension. And as students get older, the relative importance of listening comprehension increases because it takes until middle school to reach the point where reading comprehension outpaces listening comprehension. And yet, I know in most classrooms, teachers stop reading to their students around third grade, or they don't think about introducing a podcast or something to an eighth grader or a 10th grader, or nor do they think about reading anything out loud. And yet, so many of our students are still struggling with reading, both multilingual learners included. So one study shows that as students get older, problems with reading comprehension emerge. So providing an opportunity to give that content in an auditory format can really help close the content gap and help again with that vocabulary building and syntax building. Because students can understand texts when listening to them at a higher grade level than they can read them when they're in the younger grades, when they're in the learning to read, but also when they're multilingual learners and learning a new language. They understand listening at a higher grade level than they can read. So there's a great opportunity for you to grow their language through listening and reading.
Yes, that's right. Language grows, but not just through reading. It grows through interactions and through listening. And reading can't be the only way or the main way that multilingual learners experience that growth. So many studies show that the average child, like you said, doesn't reach that point of being able to read what they can understand until around middle school. And exactly what you said, Monica, for multilingual learners, this is even more important because many of them are cognitively capable of thinking and understanding at a much higher level than they can decode. So if we can get them to listen to something that's compelling and relevant, then we're going to enable them to experience information and have them talk with their peers or write about things that they want to learn and write and speak about at a more engaging way.
And then if we add reading while listening, it's just a really great way to improve comprehension. There's a social scientist named Birj Kothari who was the first to document that reading and listening together improve comprehension. And the reason I put the Bollywood film poster on here and have a clip from one is because he recognized this while observing Indians who were semi-literate or illiterate watching Bollywood movies with closed captions. And they were getting incidental exposure to reading, to vocabulary, to syntax. And he discovered that captions while listening contributed to word recognition and word comprehension skills. You can do this with audio. Listenwise is one tool that helps you to do that, but there's many, many podcasts and stories out there where you can find the text, share the transcript, and listen at the same time. And the studies have shown that this really, really helps with this kind of exposure, helps improve reading and together with listening.
Definitely. I always advocate for eyes on text as much as possible. So if we can get it in many different modalities, it's a win-win.
Yeah. So give a yay out there in the chat box if you've heard of Listenwise, but Listenwise is a tool that is free for teachers where you can sign up for free and get thousands of podcasts that we've curated for the classroom. We are curating for current events, ELA, science, social studies, and also putting in a lot of great collections for your students. And they're engaging to spark conversation and debates, but they're also flexible for the classroom and made for teachers to be able to use and step through how to teach a listening exercise before, during, and after. So it is free for the listening and sharing with your students. There's a premium features of Listenwise, which your school or you could subscribe to. which you can get a free trial of, or if you're interested in even learning more about a free pilot, you can put your email in the chat and we can talk to you more about that. But I just want to, say that what we've built is something that anyone can use for free, as I said, and get that listening going, so that you can start practicing some of these things we've just shared with you, and how vital it is to hear good academic vocabulary, in order to stretch your students' language abilities. And then some of the features that we have really are targeted at multilingual learners. You can slow down the audio. The interactive transcript highlights each word as it's spoken. So if you think back to the research I just shared with Birsh Kothari around captioning, it's even better if each word is highlighted as it's spoken. Then you can hear the authentically pronounced. And actually, that's something I want to talk about a little bit, because podcasts are very authentic. I know there are many programs out there for language learning that have audio, but it's computer generated, or it's a voice actor reading a script, not a script, but reading a book that's written for print. It's very different to hear authentic conversation, a variety of accents and voices and ages. And that's what you get when you're listening to podcasts on something like Listenwise. We also help you with a lot of these other things we show on the slide: the tiered vocabulary, the definitions in Spanish, and speech to text. Lots of things you can explore if you want to sign up for free and then take a free trial of the premium features. But I just want to emphasize again, sort of the authenticity of the speaking is important in the storytelling, because that also engages students. And we're going to have even more features coming for English learners. We're working now on a collection of stories that are appropriate for English language proficiency levels at the lower levels of ELs. And we're going to be including videos and more visual supports, as well as translations for Spanish content and additional language options. We've heard from our users that they love the authenticity of the podcast, but they're often for intermediate to advanced students. This collection is for the lower level students who are just learning English, or more intermediate, beginner to intermediate. So very excited to have that for the fall, coming back to school. So now let's move into some practical strategies for teaching speaking and listening. These are just some that we recommend on Listenwise: stopping and chunking information. All of our stories are 3 to 5 minutes long. Again, you kind of want to keep to one theme, one topic. One of the stories I'm going to share is only 30 seconds long. They're some of the very popular stories. You can use this transcripts to scaffold, and on the platform you can assign transcripts to some students and not to others who may not need it. The graphic organizers are a great way to take notes. And what's great about keeping the story short, 3 to 5 minutes, means that you could listen multiple times, either in a group or as a homework assignment. So those are just some of the best practices in the classroom that I wanted to share with you. And I want to play one example of that, because as I said, our Weird News collection has these 30-second really fun stories, and we've used them as an opportunity to build vocabulary. Valentina, as you said, building that vocabulary bank is so important. And I think it's really hard to find authentically spoken stories with a lot of vocabulary. The story we're about to listen to, is 30 seconds long, and it has 7 academic vocabulary words. So I'm just going to play it here, and you'll also see the interactive transcript.
Good morning, I'm Rachel Martin. Sometimes all you want is a familiar front porch. Maybe that's what was going through the mind of a yellow lab named Cleo when she traveled 60 miles to her family's old house in Lawson, Missouri. They moved out in 2018. The new residents recently came home to find Cleo lounging on the porch. She's since been reunited with her family at their current address. No one knows how she traveled those 60 miles, but it must be a really great front porch.
So it goes by pretty quickly, but it's only 30 seconds. You could slow it down from the original speed to go a little slower. And the words we're highlighting are resident and lounge. And those are found in the listening comprehension questions and the theme questions, and would be something that I'd recommend you suggest to students to listen for, discuss what the meaning is. And then when you have the follow-up conversation after listening, you can say, we have the question here: why were the residents of the dog's old house surprised to find her lounging on their porch? So it's just a way to incorporate a lot of pretty high level vocabulary pretty quickly into an activity. And there are many other stories there, words there as well. I mean, in addition to those two that we highlight, I can count another five that are also academic vocabulary words: recently, reunited, current. I'm wondering, Valentina, your reaction to that, and thinking about what your students how they might react to that story.
I imagine, I wish Listenwise was available when I was in the classroom, when I had students of my own. Now I advocate for others to use Listenwise with all of their students, but also with their multilingual learners at all levels of proficiency, whether students are at beginner levels of English proficiency or more advanced. I see this as a great tool for building background. So before I teach a lesson on a certain topic, I can give my students this podcast to listen to multiple times, like you said, to interact with peers. I may give them a graphic organizer to analyze the information, to kind of pull out the pieces that I want them to really look for intentionally. But it's a great way to build that background when students don't have the background yet.
Yeah, so let's move into some other strategies you may be familiar with, but I'm going to let Valentina talk through them with us.
Yes, let's talk about two strategies specifically. We're going to talk about somebody wanted but so, and we're also going to talk about teach, heart, pair, defend. And so let's go ahead and dig into teach, heart, pair, defend first. It may not be one that you've heard of before, and so I want to share this one with you. It comes from 7 Steps to a Language-Rich Interactive Classroom, which is written by John Seidlitz and Bill Perryman. And I really love this one because I would use this one with the weekly debate podcasts, which are a lot of fun. I looked at the Listenwise podcast, and I love all of them really and truly. And the debate podcasts are fun for me because they're really compelling to students. They're things that kids are going to be really interested in, want to hear. And so I would choose a debate podcast, first of all. And then I would give students an organizer, some type of organizer to take their notes as they're listening. When I first do teach, heart, pair, defend, I model it as a class. I want them to see what this is going to look like. And then after we've listened to it and we've taken our notes, I'm going to have students dictate to me, and I'm going to write in our T-chart in front of them. This is also going to be a shared writing experience that will become a shared reading experience. And I'm going to show you what this is going to look like, okay? So don't be afraid if you're like, I don't really get what this is coming to. I'm going to show you what this is going to look like. After we've created our T-chart over the podcast that we've listened to, we are going to pair up, and students are going to take a side. They are going to choose a side from our T-chart, and they're going to communicate with one another about the podcast we listened to. Some students are going to read off the T-chart we created as a class, and others are going to elaborate and add more details, because everyone's at a different proficiency level, and that's okay. They're all going to be, at their own level of English proficiency. And finally, we're going to switch sides. We're going to, whatever side we had taken initially, we're now going to have to see the other point of view. Okay, so here's what this would look like. Let's say, for example, if we listen to the podcast that was on, should podcasts be regulated? Okay, so as a class, we listened to it, or I had them listen to it individually. Now we make the T-chart together. And as a class, we're going to brainstorm, should podcasts be regulated? On one side, we are going to scribe all of the answers students give me. Now on the other side, on the right-hand side, we're going to list the reasons podcasts should not be regulated. Here's what it might look like. Podcasts should be regulated because some are spreading misinformation. And they're getting all of these bullets from the podcast they listen to. And then on the other side, they're going to tell me what to write. They're going to dictate, and I'm going to write these. I like to do it by hand because I want them to see as I write, but some people do it on a computer and type, and that's perfectly fine. Now we're going to pair up, and let's say, for example, Monica is going to be this side of the chart, and I'm going to be this side of the chart, and we are going to have a debate amongst each other. So Monica might start first by saying, you know, Valentina, I think podcasts should be regulated because some are spreading misinformation. And I may say to her, I see your point. However, podcasts should not be regulated because the government should not regulate free speech. See how I'm just reading off the T-chart? Some students will do that and others will elaborate completely. This is in the 7 Steps book, 2nd edition, page 80. I mean, it is fabulous. Students get into it, they get really animated, and then after we complete our debate, Monica and I have to switch sides. All right?
I love
so this
it.
Is, I know,
great.
it's so
That's
much fun.
great.
Yes.
Because sometimes the kids are probably thinking, why am I on this side and not that side? So they get that chance to articulate both sides of a debate.
So we start with the listening with the podcast. We move into a shared writing, and then we have them talk. Finally, we can have them write. We can have them go back to their seats now, pick a side. They can listen back to the podcast. They can go back in and listen to the podcast. And now they can write their own response. Pick a side. Pick which side you feel you believe in and write about it. So it's very scaffolded. It's scaffolded listening. It's scaffolded reading. It's scaffolded writing and listening to their partner as well. So they're getting a double dose of listening here.
That's fantastic. And I just want to note that we put up new debates every single Friday, and we are always looking for those topics that we know kids are talking about.
Oh my gosh.
Kids have cell phones in schools.
Yes.
Schools serve junk food. I mean, we really try to get those topics that are going to ignite kids' interest.
I saw them, Monica. They're really good topics. I love them so much. I wanted to talk a lot about all those topics, but there's not enough time for everything.
Yeah, so let's move on to the next one.
I know. This may be a strategy that you're familiar with. It's been around for ages, but let's talk about how we can use this with the podcast on Listenwise. So Somebody Wanted But So was made popular by Kylene Beers. But this graphic organizer was actually introduced back in 1991 by, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this name right, McCon, Bewell, and Voigt. And many teachers used it in reading, but it's also really valuable to support listening. So the way I would do this is also through a gradual release of responsibility. I'm going to model it first, and then I'm going to have them do it with their partner or a group, and then I'll have them do it on their own. So the same process, I'm going to, I might play one of the podcasts and show them exactly how I would write inside of this graphic organizer, and then I would let them do it with their partner and then individually. So as you can see in this graphic organizer, I'm going to put my visual thinking into the organizer itself. I want them to see exactly how my process becomes into writing. What's in my brain goes into the writing. So let me show you how this would look using an example from the podcast. This is a really quick one. the ketchup thief. So Monica, if you'll play that.
I would love to do that. Okay. So this is another weird news story, which means it's 30 seconds long and means you can play it multiple times and at different speeds in order to make sure you cover everything. So we highlight some vocabulary, but in this case, we're listening for the somebody wanted, SW, I've forgotten the acronym. Help me, Valentina.
Somebody wanted but so.
Somebody wanted but so. Thank you. Here we go.
Good morning, I'm David Green. An anonymous note was left at a restaurant in New Jersey. Someone confessed to stealing ketchup just for the thrill of it, writing that it felt risky. But the thief wrote that bad luck followed, including a car crash. To repent, the thief brought 2 bottles of ketchup to the restaurant along with the note, which was posted to Facebook. Now, Heinz wants in on the story. The ketchup maker is offering to pay for the damage to the car if, that is, the thief is willing to come forward.
Okay. Now, if I had a multilingual student listening to this, I would definitely have them listen to it multiple times before we filled this out. I would slow it down for them, use some visuals, all the scaffolds that a child might need, and every child is different. So here's an example of what this somebody wanted but so then summary would look like using the Weird News Ketchup Thief podcast. Somebody, a person, wanted. So a person stole ketchup from a restaurant. What did he want? He wanted to steal ketchup from a restaurant, but he felt guilty and had bad luck. So he brought 2 bottles back to the restaurant along with a note. Then Heinz offered to pay for the damages if the thief came forward. Obviously, I'm going to model this for students. I'm going to walk them through each one of these steps. We may even go back to the podcast and listen again to look for what was the so, what happened then. We want them to see where this comes from. And this is a way to synthesize the idea, to pull out the summary of the podcasts that they're hearing.
Thank you for those really great ideas for classroom strategies around a couple stories that are always great to listen to. One thing I want to just highlight before we end and go to some questions that we've been getting throughout the webinar is that we give you a way to assess comprehension. I mean, it's hard to know how well somebody is listening. And we realized when I started Listenwise that there wasn't a way to easily assess listening in any real way. It's just been done with a teacher assessing through back and forth. It's not standardized. So we created a multiple choice online auto-scored listening quiz. So for many of the stories on Listenwise, you can have your students take, typically it's a 4-question, sometimes 5-question quiz that sees if they understand the main point. Do they recall a detail? Vocabulary and context, perfect for building the vocabulary bank, or making an inference. All of these factors are so important skills to learn for reading as well. So doing it in listening helps underscore the point that reading and listening are connected. They all have those same elements that you should be focusing on as skills to become, to improve your academic language and literacy overall. And what's great about the quiz is that the student at the end immediately gets a response of how well they did and what they got right, what they got wrong. And the teacher also gets a report, which you see at the bottom left-hand corner, which shows how well the students are performing in each of the skills. So it's just a great way to practice as well. What I've heard from teachers is that sometimes because there isn't much attention paid to the listening strand, that when a student enters into the high stakes test, whether it's for English language or it's as part of like the CASP in California, there's a lack of understanding about what to do. Like, what? Listen, I put on headphones and answer questions. Like, there's just a lack of familiarity with the approach. So just practicing this can help as well.
Yes. It's so important. And, like you said, Monica, in most states, listening proficiency used to be the teacher's responsibility, and now it has become more standardized and computer-based. And I think this is such a great way to continue to formatively assess students' listening proficiency to help them do well in those end-of-year assessments.
So we have a couple questions. We're now at the end. I want to thank everyone, for being here and would love to answer more questions. So just put them in the Q&A. I know someone just asked about that, the assessment and whether these are new questions. We have a couple of different ways for you to assess the listening. One, we are building these quizzes all the time. We're adding new ones every single week. One a week on current events, and every lesson we're working up to getting them on every single lesson. And we're going to be adding them to the lower language level features, the ELD library we're building. We're going to be building simpler quizzes and also translating them into Spanish, because we know how important that is for you and your students to be able to assess where are you with the listening. But another question that was asked was about whether or not when you're doing that debate activity, Valentina, would you turn on the transcript? Would you share that with your students while you're conducting that activity?
It just depends on the students and how many times we've done this before, but I don't see why we wouldn't turn on the transcript, especially in the beginning when we're learning how to navigate the T-Chart Pair Defend, or if students are at beginner levels of proficiency in English. That may be a scaffold and a support that they need.
A couple other questions. One about the weird news stories. Yes, they are all 30 seconds long. It's amazing how much academic language they can pack into 30 seconds. I know they go quickly, but the slowed audio feature is on every podcast on Listenwise. So you can slow that down and watch the transcript as well. So that helps. The quizzes are part of premium. So that is something you'd want to take a trial of and talk to your school or academic leaders to see about getting a premium subscription in order to be able to get the quizzes as well. But the other, and also the other thing, a couple people have asked is, yes, we are recording this and we'll send it out to you, and love to, make sure you share it with your colleagues and others, because I think that, I want to spread the word about listening and how important it is in language learning and reading. And Valentina, you've been a great partner on that. And I'm wondering if in the last moments we have, is there anything you'd like to add about thinking how you can incorporate this and inspire those of us who've joined us today to add more listening into their teaching repertoire?
Oh, Monica, thank you so much for inviting me. It was really an honor. And like I said, if Listenwise was out there when I was in the classroom, I would have loved to use it with my students to increase their listening, which will increase their speaking, their reading, and their writing. I would use this to help develop students' background, to help them hear more vocabulary, to help them speak with their peers. And it's just a wealth of knowledge. And I'm so glad that you're continuing to build those supports for multilingual learners into Listenwise. You're listening to your audience, to the teachers that work with Listenwise.
Yes,
that's awesome.
We love to hear from you. And that's why we're adding these lower level language stories and videos and translations. They'll be ready for back to school, so keep an eye out for them. And I just want to thank you so much, Valentina Gonzalez, for joining us today and talking about the importance of listening and reading for our multilingual learners.
Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Thank you all for joining us from around the globe.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all very much, and have a great day.